So, this is not the kind of video often seen in my channel, but it's one that I've been very eager to share with you guys ever since I started doing photography again. For those who have been watching my streams for quite some time, you guys already know this, but for those who are new, I've been a professional photographer since 2017, and it has been one of the most amazing passions of mine since the very beginning. Only recently have I been sharing this passion with my viewers and my community on Twitch and whatnot, and I wanted to take this opportunity to also share some of the things that I learned as a photographer with your beautiful faces. Let's go. How's it going, everyone? Hope you all having a fantastic day. My name is DeSynkro, and today, guys, I wanted to share some tips that I've learned through my time as a photographer with some of you guys. Let's get right onto it. Kicking off with tip number one, guys, is to shoot raw. One of the biggest things that you need to do as a photographer is change your camera settings to shoot raw. Chances are your camera settings are probably set to JPEG right now. Most cameras from factory default is JPEG. If you go into your settings, there should be an option to switch from JPEG to RAW. Go ahead on your cameras and do that. Trust me on this. Why do you want to shoot RAW? Because you will retain the most and highest amount of quality with RAW than you would with JPEG. Here's an unedited photo of my friend Caitlin that I took a while back and whatnot. As you can see, the photo is very, very bright. By turning down the exposure a little bit, we can actually recover some significant details that we wouldn't otherwise if we took the photo in JPEG. We were able to recover enough detail to the point where the photo is usable again. Think of the RAW format as a way of going back into the moment that you took the photo and fixing it on the spot. Things like these just cannot be achieved to the same level without the use of RAW. Here's the exact same image but in JPEG, and as you can see, we can only recover very, very little amount of details in comparison to what we can with RAW. So number one thing, guys, shoot RAW.
How do I recover or open a RAW image to fix it?
That is very simple. You can use Camera Raw or Lightroom to not only adjust but also edit the image even further. If you can't afford those pieces of software, then you can actually use Photopea as well. It has a very, very basic editor, but it gets the job done. Not as good as the former, but at least it's free. So shoot RAW. That one image that you were about to delete because it was a little bit overexposed could potentially be salvageable, and it could end up being one of the best photos that you've taken the whole day. Tip number two, experiment and don't fear mistakes. Your mistakes will lead you to your improvement as a photographer. Nowadays, cameras are so incredibly advanced that you can take hundreds of photos in just a matter of seconds. Try different angles, different positions, pay attention to your surroundings, and just experiment. Your only limitation really is your will to keep going and taking awesome photos. And your battery life. And your memory card space. And your real life responsibilities. Learning from experience and your mistakes is really one of the best ways to learn and develop your talent as a photographer. And when I say don't fear mistakes, I don't mean that just when you're taking the photo. It also applies to your editing, whether or not you're editing them on Photoshop or Lightroom and whatnot, which leads me to one of the biggest pieces of advice actually that I can give anyone. Learn from other photographers. Trying out different styles will help you develop your own. Find some photographer creators, whether that's on YouTube, Twitch, or even IRL for that matter, and learn how they do their photos. Mimic them if you have to. Eventually, after mimicking their style for a while, you're gonna notice things that you like, and you're gonna notice things that you don't like. And that's gonna help you develop your own style because you're gonna be doing things the way that you want and the way that you prefer. Just remember that at the end of the day, photography is an art, and art is unique to everyone. If you like the style that you're working with, then try your best to perfect it and forge your own path. And last but not least, we have tip number three. Learn to use manual mode. Ever wonder how some photographers take some really nice photos of like light trails, or they take like a photo of a cityscape and it's like super sharp and well lit and not grainy at all? These are just two examples of some of the many things that you can do by learning how to use manual mode on your camera. Manual mode on your camera makes it so you, the photographer, basically control every aspect of your camera. Your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, all completely set by you.
But why should I learn this? Don't most cameras do everything automatically nowadays?
Yes, they do. Kinda. Shooting manual is actually a really good way to learn more about your camera and what each feature of the camera does, such as your shutter speed, your f-stop, and your ISO, and know exactly what to change, and when you want to capture the moment in a very specific way. Learning manual will actually help you as well if you're trying to learn things like the priority modes, such as aperture and shutter priority on your camera. So what exactly do each of these things that you change actually do? Well, first of all, you have your shutter speed. Shutter speed is basically how long your shutter stays open and how long your sensor gets exposed to light. The more light that your sensor gets exposed to, the more well lit the photo is. But there's a downside. The longer the shutter stays open, the more blurry everything becomes depending on the movement. Whether that's your hands shaking when you're taking the photo or the subject that you're taking a photo of starts moving a little bit, it all contributes towards the final product of the photo being relatively blurry. But this is how photos of those light trails are taken, because you're leaving the shutter open. Any decently bright light that actually goes in front of the camera leaves a light trail. If you're doing something like this, you're really gonna need a tripod as well, because otherwise your photos are just gonna end up blurry like this. Probably not what you want to be posting on your Instagram. Next up, you have your aperture or your f-stop. Aperture, or the f-stop on your camera, is basically how wide the aperture blades on your lens are open. The lower the f-stop on your camera, the more wide the aperture blades are on your lens and more light can go in. Having your aperture wide open gives you that delicious and buttery smooth bokeh and that blurry background that you see on the images that everyone and their mom loves. Pretty much the exact opposite applies if you have the f-stop on your camera set to a high number. The higher the number, the more closed the aperture on your lens is. The more closed that it is, the less light you have coming through, which then you have to compensate by increasing the ISO, we'll get to that in a second, or your shutter speed, so then you can get more light coming in. So why would you want to close your aperture? Why not just leave it wide open for more light? Remember how having the aperture wide open made the background blurry? Closing the aperture lets less light in, but actually keeps in focus a lot more elements on your photo too. And because of this, you're actually able to get more things in focus. Last but not least, you have your ISO. ISO increases your camera's sensitivity to light. Think of ISO as almost like adding fake light to your images. You'll find yourself using that a lot in situations that the image is very underexposed. It's great for bringing up light in a lot of situations that are a little bit too dark. You'll probably find yourself using a decent amount of ISO in things such as nighttime photography or even in places that are a bit dark. The main issue with ISO is that the higher the ISO, the more grainy your images become. That's not always a bad thing though. Grain can be seen as a really bad thing in a lot of photos, and in certain situations, yeah, it can be. But, and that's a big but, it's not always a horrible thing, and sometimes it's not even noticeable unless you really zoom in on the photo. And that's it. Those were some of the things that I've learned on my journey as a photographer and whatnot. It's been a hell of a crazy journey, but one that I can say was probably one of the best. Which actually leads me to one of the most important tips of them all. Have fun. At the end of the day, photography is not about getting the best shot or being the best. It's about taking photos of the things that you love and the memories that is forged along the way. The best thing about photography to me is not the final shot, it's the journey there.